Right, okay, so let's make a start. Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to this roundtable discussion, Comics and Neurodiversity, an Emancipatory Medium, where we will be discussing the role of comics as a valuable accessibility tool and creative outlet for neurodiverse readers. I want to first, as a quick disclaimer, want to acknowledge the definition of neurodiverse, as I understand that it's often a point of contention in some circles as to what the term actually means, and to some extent if it's even valid on occasion. But in the loosest sense, it is defined as being a variation in the human brain regarding sociability, learning, attention, mood, and other mental functions in a non-pathological sense. So it can include learning disabilities, neurodevelopmental disorders, and some mental health conditions. So we're all going to introduce ourselves. My name is Ellen Walker. I'm going to be chairing this talk. I'm a recent graduate of the MA Visual Communication course, and my final project has been an autobiographical graphic novel which details my experiences as someone growing up with learning disabilities in a neurodiverse family environment, and how I traversed the British school system with these conditions. And the reason I wanted to chair this talk was because I do feel as if, as I was working on the project, I did feel as though there was definitely a sense of, what do you call it? Not a lot of attention given to comics as being a medium which is very, very important, particularly in education circles for neurodiverse learners. So I feel like this is definitely a discussion we need to have. And I've got some fantastic guests with me who are going to introduce themselves. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thanks for inviting me on, and hello to everyone and to our audience. Yeah, my name is Paul Gravett, and I've been championing this medium of comic, sequential art, whatever we want to call it. We want graphic storytelling, all these graphic novels, all these fancy terms for comics. They're comics, basically. For many years, I've been involved with exhibitions. I've done a big show with John Harris Dunning at the British Library, Comics Unmasked, which you might have seen perhaps if you're in London. This medium is remarkable. I mean, I ought to be getting bored with it. And every day I discover new artists, I discover forgotten material. It's a global medium on a scale that few people, I certainly can't grasp. It's remarkable, and it's doing so many things. So this is an important discussion, because I'm quite sure we're going to learn over this next hour the role that comics can really play in the classroom and in college and in art colleges, including, of course, the RCA itself. So thank you very much for having me, and over to the next person. I'm not sure who's next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Qona Rankin, and like all of us, I wear lots of hats. I'm an educator, designer maker, author, and more recently, activist for the neurodiverse community. School was a nightmare for me because I couldn't read, I certainly couldn't spell, and I got all my numbers mixed up. But I discovered the Beano, fantastic, which I absolutely loved. Eventually I got to art school, and I ended up teaching on the product design BA at the University of Hertfordshire. But then came the opportunity to retrain as a dyslexia tutor. And I've been at the RCA as the dyslexia coordinator ever since. And I'm really excited to be part of Ellen's event, Comics and Neurodiversity, because I think it's so important, the work she's doing. And I'm going to hand over to Simon, I think.
Hello, everybody. I'm Simon Woodfield. Thank you, Ellen, for inviting me to this event. I work at the V&A Museum in the commercial department, and I suppose I identify as being dyslexic, which I didn't find out until sort of quite late on in my career. I did an arts degree, and after about 15 years after leaving school, and it was during that degree that I discovered I was dyslexic, and that was sort of over 15 years ago. I also have a son now who's 12, who's also dyslexic, but also has been diagnosed with ADHD. So I've had sort of experience also as a parent. So I've got my experience of going through school without really realizing I was neurodiverse, and now have a son who's also going through education with the challenges there are, and also being able to sort of see the difference between my experience and his experience. I guess I used to read comics as in my youth, and I don't think I actually read a book until I was probably in my early 20s. So it's really interesting to be invited to this event, because I think actually my relationship with comics probably ended when I became a teenager, but maybe we can discuss something about that later on in the event. I'll hand over to Roland next.
Hello everyone. Hi Ellen, and I wanted to say a big shout out to Maddie Burt. I haven't seen her for 20 years, but she's in the audience somewhere here. I'm an interdisciplinary designer, curator, producer. I haven't really got a name for myself, to be honest with you, but like I graduated from the RCA last year during COVID. I was diagnosed with dyslexia on my undergraduate degree at Wimbledon in 2008, and whilst I was at the RCA, I specialised in designing inclusive environments for learning. I'm the co-founder of Neurodiversity in Albertopolis, along with Qona and Simon and Sarah Rankin, who's not here, I don't think. And that's a network that was set up for neurodivergent students and staff working in higher education to connect over the issues they face as disabled people who are working and studying in our institutions. That's it. Over to you, Ellen.
Thank you so much, everybody. So I'd like to kickstart just by asking, because I feel like this would be a good way to introduce this topic. But Qona, from what I have found from a personal perspective, having spoken to others like myself who have somewhat troubling processing issues, because like Roland and Simon, I was not diagnosed until a couple of years ago when I was 21. So when I was during my undergraduate degree, but I have found that comics and more broadly visual narrative has acted as a kind of gateway language for people like me. And I often refer to it as existing on the same wavelength of thinking. And I was wondering if from your perspective and your experience working in this field, if you could expand on this, why it's so important for these types of brains.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so important not to feel excluded, isn't it? And I think that, I mean, my mum was actually very, I think, sort of clever in some ways. She bought me fantastic books. I've got some of them here. Pantalone and Angelo and Rosalind by Bettina. And the illustrations are absolutely fantastic. I apologize for people who are only listening and can't see, but they really are absolutely gorgeous. And The Unhappy Hippopotamus by Nancy Moore, which was a beautiful story about Harriet the unhappy hippopotamus who couldn't smile. And eventually her friend Mouse made her smile. And they were so lovely. And I used to look at the pictures and make up my own stories. It didn't really matter, but I didn't feel excluded. I felt I was part of the world. And when other kids had books, I would have my, well, essentially picture books. But for me, they contained words because they were my own words. And again, actually, when I was at the RCA, in fact, can I share my screen and just show something quickly? So I was doing my dissertation at the RCA, and I couldn't think. There was one particular section where I was talking about why visual research, which was a key component to most BA design courses back in the 80s, why it didn't seem to help students who were struggling to draw what was in their mind's eye, or to put it in academic lingo, which I was required to do, externalize their conceptions of form on paper. And I was discussing this with my neighbour, Kipper Williams, who's a cartoonist, who started doodling and then said, "Is this what you mean?" And I'm sharing my screen now and I'm showing a slide of Kipper's cartoons. So we worked on a cartoon which expressed exactly what I was trying to write, but I couldn't. And then I found during my teaching as well that when I was teaching on product design BA, that students often had the same difficulties with their dissertations, that they could show me pictures or they could draw something that they wanted to express. And actually it was through having a conversation with them about that we together, we could dig up the words that fitted the image. So it was sort of like working the other way around, I suppose. I don't know, does that answer your question, Ellen?
Yes, definitely. I do find it fascinating how there is this kind of this connection in a way between literacy and learning, and then also using visual aids, and then also as a form of expression, like you were explaining with when you were doing your dissertation. And if I mean, one of the things that actually prompted me to host this talk was finding an article written by Paul Gravett, which was entitled "Learning to Read from Comics as Gateways to Literacy," because unfortunately it's become widely accepted in some academic spaces, particularly in primary and secondary education in the UK, that comics are somehow an inferior form of literacy. But as you discovered, the argument against this has existed for much, much longer than that. I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yes, thank you. That was a lucky encounter with two teachers who had to remain anonymous. They were teaching in the East End of London, particularly teaching actually kids who were neurodiverse, certainly were challenged, and certainly didn't read. And this is the extraordinary thing, I'm afraid. I find it extraordinary that people don't read. I mean, not that they can't read, but they actually just don't have books, or they're not exposed to it. They're not encouraged to enjoy reading. And they shared with me their experiences of trying to get a very reluctant class. Turns out that white boys, well, I was a white boy, I suppose, but white boys in particularly just don't read these days, and it's very hard to get them to read in school, or certainly out of school. And they had a real struggle, these two teachers, getting getting to introduce comics, graphic novels, in fact, into the classroom. The interviews were very inspiring on the one hand because they had great success. What was interesting is that many of the kids they're about 11, I think they were around age 11, something like that, I think was the 1 year they got. They thought, oh, comics are baby stuff. We don't read comics. But so even though they'd never read them, they were dismissing them. But once they got to see them, the two books that these teachers chose really excited them so much. And part of the excitement, I think, was what you've just been saying actually a little bit, Qona, as well, is that there was room for their stories, room for their words, their ideas. The great choice that the teachers made was to start with Sean Tan's The Arrival, which, as you may know, is it's a wordless, an English textless graphic novel or children's book, picture book, whatever you want to call it, which is all to do with an immigrant experience where you are in a world where you can't make yourself heard, you can't understand. There is language, there are weird, indecipherable, cryptic looking texts all around you. And so you have to resort to other ways of communicating in the most simple way. And it's very evocative and touching. And it was open enough for these kids to really engage with it and make it their own, individualize it in that sense too. And they would end up actually just doing like one page at a time. They were going so deeply into these pages, discuss the composition, the illustration. This was truly an engagement that these teachers hadn't realized was possible before. That was the inspiring side. The disappointing side, if not somewhat depressing side, is that they had to struggle so much to get even this crack in the door to open. And then it wasn't, as far as I know, followed up with very much, even though there was tremendous results from this, even though even other classes were saying, why aren't we doing this? You know, we want these graphic novels in the classroom as well. And I'm afraid I haven't been able to keep in touch with them. They were both one was Canadian, one had taught in Canada. And I was thinking, I want to find out what happened, because one of the other teachers took the pilot they'd done to another school. She was about to move to Wales. I'm sure these things are going on, probably not very joined up, possibly even amongst some of our audience here. There were people who will know of other instances, but what they encountered was such a deep institutional resistance to innovation and change. And the phrase was, the teaching profession, the teaching Ministry of Education, all of these people supposedly in charge, and they are in charge, of course, moving at a glacier's pace, which is pretty damn slow. And to give an idea of that glacier's pace, as you mentioned, Ellen, there's been a thesis that was put together in 1945 by an American woman, all about the role of comics in literacy and in the classroom. 1945 in America, based on quite a lot of reports by top educators previous to this, during the course of the 30s, 40s, looking particularly, of course, at an American comic book, which was an enormously powerful medium. It's probably the equivalent, say, probably today to games or people's various smartphone apps and things, but it was something that people just were totally invested in. And they found not only a fantastic response to comics being used, but also still a lot of resistance. So one of the comments I wanted to just read out here is, most educators are critical of the comics without a thorough knowledge of them. Therefore, an investigation by the classroom teacher is vitally necessary before the issue of the worth of comics is discussed. So that's what we're still encountering. Here we are 70 something years later, coming up, I think, still going, well, perhaps comics are a force for literacy, for literacies we need to be talking about here, by the way, visual as well as verbal, as I think we're probably all aware of, but that's not something that is thought about when we think of reading. But we have to read the world. We're reading images and texts in combination all the time, and very rarely actually do we really just look at text. It seems to me anyway. And then in terms of the responses, this is a very good comment here from Josette Frank. At the time, by the way, American comic book publishers realized there was still a lot of negative views about comic books. So they brought in various experts from education, childcare, etc., just to underline that they were reviewing the comics and endorsing them as a valid medium. One of these was Josette Frank, who's quite a big name in the history of American education. And she wrote in Progressive Education in January 1942, so that is nearly 70 years ago. She said, "I am profoundly convinced of this, that children read the comics because they find in them a very real and deep and vital satisfaction of some innermost need of their own." I like the fact she left that actually slightly undefined and open, because we know that there's something going on here. Neurodiversity interacts with comics precisely because comics are such an extraordinarily open, interpretable, accessible medium. They are something that invites people to find their own stories. So that's the background. And just to update a couple of things, one exciting development which is going on right now is a website called comicarteurope.eu, where 4 major international comics partners across Europe, one of them is the Lakes International Comic Art Festival, which is coming up in October in Kendal. And it's a fantastic festival. By the way, it's the first major UK festival to get big funding, I mean, seriously big funding from the Arts Council, who are realizing, oh yes, we should do a comics festival perhaps and put some money into that. And one of their projects is to work with a school. I've got notes somewhere about it, but there is a school anyway, local school with kids, to just investigate, do a proper study and say, what can comics bring into the classroom, in particular dealing with literacy. And those results are going to be shared. There's the other three partners in this project are doing similar projects with other sectors, not always in schools, but perhaps with disadvantaged people, with single families, single parents, I should say, other people, just to figure out what can it be doing, what can comics do. So what we're still researching this, and this fantastic conference just now is still discussing it. But it seems like, hello, we shouldn't be doing this. We should be getting on with it. I mean, so obviously is something that the comics can do in a remarkable way. Okay.
Can I just add to that, Paul? The first comic published by Harvard University Press was in 2015, and it's called Unflattening, and it was actually a PhD thesis. Yes, Nick Susanis, and I came across this about 7 years ago, and I was so excited by it. I have got an image which I could quickly show from that.
Yes, that ties in very well with what you were showing with your work with Kipper Williams. Exactly, engaging in a medium like this. Yeah. So yes, I mean, we're getting there, but it is incredibly slow, isn't it? It is. I mean, one would hope generational change would actually make a difference. I mean, but that's not quite a glacier's pace, but it's still slow. But we are up against a lot of negative views about the medium still, which, by the way, just briefly goes right back at least to a huge scare that went around most of the world, almost all the world, post-World War II. Comics were demonized, particularly American comics, which often dealt with crime and horror. They were dealing with adult subject matter, but they were also undoubtedly trying to elevate, not in every case, but certainly to move the medium away from being thought of as juvenile and saying we can address adult themes. And one of the great champions against comics in the UK was the National Union of Teachers, who organized a touring exhibition showing the worst examples of horror and crime comics, and also provided a film strip which could be sent around to schools to be projected, again, to warn children of these comics. The fascinating side effect of this was that for many kids, this was the first time visiting kids or kids at school had ever seen or heard of these comics. And when they saw them, they thought, wow, where do I find them? And they couldn't find them in W.H. Smith's, but they could find them, fortunately, in a lot of the slightly murkier newsagents in the back streets, and undoubtedly sales probably spiked as a result of this. But they were dead set against comics. And there's a big story still getting revealed now, even now, about, in America and internationally, what lay behind this. Why was there such a distrust of the medium? Yeah.
See, it's fascinating. I mean, going back to the idea of comics in educational environments, I recall having a very interesting conversation with Roland not long ago about how I found your perspective very interesting, because you're someone who, as you said, sort of struggled quite a bit in education, being someone who had undiagnosed disabilities, but then for you going into education as a career path and seeing how some education environments are often not learner specific, but then you were talking about how to revolutionize it and how to change it to make it less holistic and more individualistic for specific learning brains. But could you expand on that? There's wonderful things that we were talking about.
Well, I think when I was at the RCA, one of the conversations that arose was the design of the studios in White City, which very much seemed centered around the sort of design ideology of one person, and designing not around the individual, but designing something for a mass group of people to work in the exact same way. So we started to lobby the college in order to try and change those spaces and get those desks, which were fixed into position, removed. I don't know how deep I can go into this, but one of the outcomes was that we've created a work in progress show that was a studio. So our work in progress show last year, instead of putting on a traditional exhibition, we turned the space that we were given into a working studio space that provided all of the facilities that we would want to encounter as individuals accessing that space. I'm fully aware that not all institutional spaces can be designed around the individual, but I think if we start at a process of like maybe like a ground zero where nothing exists, then we can build on that. So give our students the ability to make their own spaces rather than have spaces and environments which they're not, which aren't suitable for them to be working in, designed by them, with maybe the consultation of an accessibility specialist. I think that is starting to happen. I bumped into Tracy the other day and she said that the studios are being completely cleared out of all of these desks that were, I don't know, I haven't got a photograph of it, but if you can imagine a row of desks that is totally fixed in place like a call center, each individual space was like 2 meters by 1 meter. That was the space that we were given to work in a big open space. There were no quiet spaces to work. So yeah, does that answer the question? I don't know. Sorry.
No,
probably not as interesting as the conversation that we had the other week.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, on the subject of, because I do feel as well, and I do think that this is very relevant to the idea of comics, but there is also an importance in terms of the environment that you're in, because there is something that is really underrated about the value of having a very visually minded space. I mean, I do recall I did not visit the V&A, for example, until fairly recently, and there was a part of me that felt as though it was a very neurodiverse space, or it was a very ADHD space from my perspective, because it was if, you know, you go into another room and then there's a complete, you know, whole host of densely packed objects, and you can just, you know, let yourself, you know, just shower yourself in all these wonderments of the ages. Simon, I wanted to ask you, how do you think, what do you personally think are the, as someone who's worked at the V&A, what would you say are the merits of visual narrative and very visual environments, so from an educational or a communication perspective?
I mean, I don't know if I can say it from a V&A perspective. I mean, I don't work in education. I mean, I would just say actually that my space where I actually work, or did work last year, because I have only been into the museum once in the last year, I had a problem because it was a similar sort of desk arrangement to Roland was saying, and I've also been trying to sort of change things from that point of view. I mean, I think for me, visual narrative, and, you know, talking to thinking about my experience and talking about, you know, I used to read comics, and I got to the age, I think, where I felt I sort of grew out of them. I used to read, you know, Dandy and Beano, and then I think around the age of 10, I sort of grew out of them, and I didn't feel that there was anything sort of an option for sort of in the teenage years. Maybe that was through a bit of ignorance, or I'm not sure if there in the sort of early 70s, if there were those sort of options then, as I think there might have been later on, and maybe now. So for me, I think the thing that I turned to after sort of growing up on comics was film, as a visual narrative, which really appealed to me, and I think going through my teenage years and in my early 20s, I really that was, you know, I would never read the book. I would always watch the film, so to speak. And I can remember when I was sort of thinking about this event, I can remember when I was probably reading comics, my first experience of cinema was probably and some people in the audience might remember that films used to be advertised outside cinemas in these sort of glass boxes, and they would just have sort of black and white photos, still images of scenes from the film, and it's kind of like this sort of storyboarding, which I think really drew me in. And then I think also the experience actually of being in the cinema. As I say, my son, you know, has ADHD, and I suspect that there's some in my family, and I think that experience of going into a cinema where you're just the screen is so dominant, it enables someone to be able to focus on that medium. So for me, you know, I think the merits of visual narrative. I mean, you know, talking about literacy earlier. I mean, I think, you know, literacy is just one part of, you know, education, and it's, if you're just talking about reading and writing, it's sort of one dimension of learning, and that if in an educational setting, if people are to benefit from an education, then I think we need a sort of a three-dimensional education or four-dimensional education that looks at visual narrative in comics and film, and not just literacy in reading.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting also when you mentioned film, because I never thought until now that, in a way, because with the storyboarding process that goes into film, it is pretty much a comic, the way that they work things out. And when you read comics, there is a kind of a filmic nature to them in a way. So I do wonder why, because film as a medium is definitely at a more elevated state, certainly in education to a certain extent than comics is, and yet they're basically, in a weird way, that they're kind of the same thing. Only one is, you know, still images that have been drawn, and the other one is taking those still images and making them move.
I mean, clearly there are many people have thought of comics as being a film on paper. But as we all know, I think a storyboard, if you do look at a storyboard, it's not really like a comic. It's really just, it doesn't use the language of comics fully, for a start. And often the framing of films or the direction and the sequencing in films is very different to comics. And this is one of the things where I think comics do have a strength. They may not be totally immersive. You're not in the dark with nothing else to look at. And they certainly don't have, you know, 4D IMAX overwhelming images, and they don't have music to tell you, oh, by the way, this bit is scary, by the way, just in case we can make you feel scared just from the music, of course. And they don't have actors. I mean, I've had a very weird relationship to film, because I'm so completely overwhelmed by comics that films has lost its magic for me, precisely for what it's supposed to be, its magic. Because what I love about comics is they're all things they can't do, that they make you do, that they make you, the reader and interpreter, do. And that's where I think, again, that neurodiversity is still, I think, more stimulated and more accessible, more satisfied, I suggest, from comics, because they leave that openness. It's not just, here's the story, here's the one way to think, which is really all it's about, which is why movies are directed. And I'm not very good at being directed. I want to direct myself, please. Yeah.
There's
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. On Sunday night, I saw The Reason I Jump, which is a film of the book written by Naoki Higashida, in which he explains his autistic and non-verbal brain and how that works. And the film has a very sort of collage-like capacity, almost similar to comics. And I learned more in that just over an hour about autism, and particularly non-verbal autism, than I have done from any book I've read about it. And I was thinking about this event, Ellen, and thinking, I know you were talking about perhaps running workshops to help neurodiverse children explore their own ways of thinking and how their brains process information and feelings through comics. And this film is sort of redolent of that. You know, so for example, there's one of the participants is talking about his memory. And he said that and the narrative says, you know, my memory doesn't work in a linear way. My memory has bursts of bubbles. And at that time, they were sort of showing these bubbles kind of bursting into sharp focus and then sort of floating away. It reminded me a bit of if you have a hose playing on a very sort of hot summer's day, you get sort of sparkles of light and they go off in all different directions. And I suddenly thought, gosh, you know, if your memory works like that, so you've got no perception of how long it was ago, it could have been 17 years ago, but suddenly the memory pops into your head and it's like it was yesterday. So, and I was thinking about your idea with, you know, neurodiverse children and comics, and I think that would be brilliant to do that. Anyway, I thoroughly recommend the film. Sorry.
I'm definitely going to have to watch that because I read the book and it was fantastic. I think also because what I've noticed some of the words that have been brought up so far, there's openness, and then there's also this idea of it's almost there's a thing with comic, because when I was working on mine, because a lot of it was down to I didn't want to do it completely chronologically, because I understood that, because I was talking about things to do with myself growing up, because I had a younger sister who was diagnosed with autism, and I wasn't diagnosed until years later. So it was I was finding it difficult when I was just writing the script. I remember finding it very difficult to try and illustrate the concurrence of narratives, because there's a fantastic way through comics in which you can bring concurrent narratives together. So I could simultaneously bring in the context of today, knowing the conditions that I have, and then looking at it in the context of when I was growing up, and, you know, seeing them in a completely different manner. And that wouldn't have been possible at all through you know, purely writing it. If I were to write a book, it wouldn't have done it at all. But there was a book I read many years ago, and it was one of the catalysts that led me to want to produce this comic. But it's called Epileptic by David B. And I absolutely adore that comic, because it was the first book that I ever read, because there was not really, when I was growing up, there was not really a lot of media available that I could read, and that was associated with disability, having siblings with these conditions. But in Epileptic, it talks about this guy's relationship with his brother and their childhoods growing up, and his brother having epilepsy. And throughout the whole book, it details how they felt ostracized in society. So if his brother had a seizure, there would be people that, you know, shooting, you know, accusatory gazes. I mean, I remember there was one particular image where the brother is having a seizure, and there's this fantastic illustration of all these people surrounding them with huge, you know, boggly eyes staring at them. And I remember that so vividly growing up. You know, if my sister was having a meltdown or something like that, there'd be people who just didn't understand, and you would feel as if you just feel these eyes, you know, bearing down on you. And it was so cathartic for me, for someone feeling quite isolated and not feeling as if I had anyone to talk to about this, to just feel as if I was understood. And that is one of the things that I mean, in a broader sense, you know, regardless of what the subject matter is, there is that sense with comics that you can almost, in the same way that you can immerse yourself in a regular book with just pure text, with comics, you've got the images, you feel yourself being sucked into the narrative a lot more, or that the series of narratives, there's just something more immersive about it. And that's, in a way, kind of mirrors the way that the neurodiverse brain, or specifically, ADHD, dyspraxia, where you often feel as though your mind is going off in completely different directions simultaneously, that just fits incredibly well.
If I just jump in here, I mean, Patrick Anderson, I think his name is, he's just mentioned graphic medicine, which is something that perhaps some people here on this, listening to this or watching this, won't know about. If you look at graphicmedicine.org, this is a phenomenon that's taken off. I think it took off about maybe 10 years ago, maybe 2010. I seem to remember I went to the first conference in London. Yeah, it's a British invention. And this was saying, look, there's a connection that needs to be built up here between the medical humanities and comics and graphic novels, especially because there's a real disjoint often between the people with various afflictions, whatever they may be, and those caring for them or trying to treat them, even, for example, medical students as well, trying to understand what is their so-called bedside manner, how do they interact with their patients, and how often patients and carers' perspectives are not listened to and not expressed. A good friend of mine, Brian Fees, put together a very early webtoon called Mum's Cancer, about his experience and difficulties, because there was nothing out there for other carers to really to learn from and to share. It became a phenomenal, important webcomic and a graphic novel as a result of that. And this field of graphic medicine is very rich, and everything from autobiographical material, people expressing their own, dealing with their own illnesses and diversities, etc., but also carers, also and doctors as well. And it's just, again, a tremendously rich source of material. Yeah, and Epileptic by David B. I'd recommend to people very highly. What David B. does cleverly with this also is he personifies the illness, the epilepsy, as this almost kind of primitive art, if that's the right word for it, sort of indigenous arts sort of creature. And one of the interesting questions he asks himself, of course, is maybe the reason I'm the way I am is that I haven't got epilepsy, but at the same time there's the fear that he might get it, and also the fact that he has this outlet of expression through comics, that comics for him is the ideal medium that he's found. So yeah, I just thoroughly recommend that graphic medicine approach to explore that.
I would definitely recommend, that I remember looking at, and the Mum's Cancer as well was that was fantastic as well, because there's almost the other one I think is a book called Stitches, and I can't remember the name of the
David Small.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. And that was fantastic. That was about a boy. It was an autobiographical graphic novel, and it's about a young boy growing up with. I think it was definitely a very severe chronic illness, and that was one of those things where I think there is a sense of, because whenever I would read about these conditions that weren't in comic form or weren't written from the perspective of the people who were experiencing them, there was always a very kind of clinical aspect. I mean, even when I myself have written, if I've wanted to sit down in the work up to doing this novel, I basically sat down and wrote about the ways in which my brain works, what these different conditions mean for me as a person. And I couldn't help but get quite clinical, because you end up sort of using words like processing and delayed responses and all this, and not there's anything wrong with that, because it's a very good way of describing it. But as soon as I started sitting down and drawing these things, it was as if you get more of a sense of the emotions surrounding it, and that's something which is often missing when we're talking about neurodiversity, particularly with children. That's something that really needs to be taken into account, the way that one feels if they're either growing up in a family where they have a disabled sibling, or whether they themselves are growing up with these conditions. It's fascinating.
One note in the chat, which we should just bring in, as we've just been discussing epileptic, Patricia just mentioned that Epileptic is quite a dark, difficult adult book. It's not something maybe to give to a younger reader.
Not a very, very small child. I think I was about maybe 13 or 14. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is quite heavy stuff. Yeah, so full disclaimer. Yeah.
Can I just mention just one brief thing? I don't want to talk too much here, sorry.
That's fine.
But one of the findings that I didn't mention from these two teachers that I mentioned that were doing the trying to introduce graphic novels. By the way, the other graphic novel they introduced was Mouse Guard by David Peterson, which is basically very cute mice, but wrapped up in a kind of Tolkien kind of world, but beautifully done, a whole real world developed. Is inferences. This was interesting that they felt that comics would be a way for their their pupils to grasp what inferences are. In other words, whether somebody says one thing but means something else, or is feeling something different to what they say, that seemed to be easier to get across in comics than in regular prose fiction, for example. And that I thought was an interesting, we don't even think about, you have to, and if we're going to understand and interact with media with intelligence, politicians for one thing, we've got to be able to do a lot of inference, haven't we? We've got to understand, what are they saying, what are they meaning, or what are they feeling? And that I thought was, again, something that comics can do, because you've got the dual soundtracks of the text and the pictures. And they're not just disappearing in a movie, they're there on that page, they're fixed for you to go back to and to really study. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I was wondering, unless there is anything that anyone else wants to raise in terms of points of interest, if we might see if there are any questions at all. If anyone can pose questions in the chat and we can answer them. But if in the meantime, whilst they're doing that, is there anything else that anyone would like to bring up that we might not have mentioned?
I mean, one thing occurs to me that I'm a naive, I can ask a naive question, but is there a way of diagnosing these conditions better, quicker? Is that a very naive question for somebody to ask? But I mean, because it's important that a school environment, for example, knows what you're going through. So how is there anything in place for that to be improved in the future?
Yeah, I think there is, if I can jump in here. Yeah, the problem is money, Paul, because the assessment costs £450 thereabouts. And so within the state sector anyway, parents can't possibly afford to pay that much. But also there's not the knowledge to ask for it as well. So there's two things really. One is parents aren't demanding it, parents can't afford it, but also the schools are reluctant to push it as well, because then they have to provide the support and they haven't got any money either. So it's a vicious circle in a way, but you're absolutely right. The younger a child has a diagnosis and the younger the support can be put into place.
I would like to carry on that. Like, I think also that these things like dyslexia and autism are still stigmatized heavily. And I think maybe that a lot of the time that can be class dependent as well. A lot of people that I talk to, I mentor students occasionally, young students, and through family friends who have children who are clearly somewhere on the spectrum or neurodiverse, they don't want their children to be tested because they're worried about the stigma that they might receive upon being tested. And that is one of the main things that we need to get over at the same time as testing in schools. I mean, these things can all work hand in hand, can't they? But I think it would take for local educational authorities and schools to try and, push this sort of envelope that we keep on talking about.
I mean, alternatively, if all teachers taught in ways that were sympathetic for dyslexic learners, if there was a menu, if you like, of or a way of matching students' individual learning styles with the teacher's teaching style, then that would be sort of another way of doing it. So then you didn't need a diagnosis because everybody could learn in the way they wanted to. But, you know,
and that would be the true, like, that would be the true kind of ethos of neurodiversity, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
And
if I could,
sorry,
if I could sort of add, I mean, as Qona knows, I've sort of been doing a bit of work with the BDA, and I know that you know, that they trying to propose that, you know, every school has a, you know, a dyslexia assessor, and that would probably be better if it was a neurodiversity assessor for every school. But as you say, Qona, yes, it is funding, I forgot what I was going to add to that now. But yes, yeah, funding, and also actually the other thing is teachers, when they're doing their PGCE, I believe there isn't any training in neurodiversity during a period PGCE as well. So I think I've seen some figures that are really frightening about the sort of awareness in the teaching profession, especially sort of primary and secondary school level, in not only awareness but also kind of the sort of attitude to neurodiversity, you know, from teachers right up to head teachers.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there is a module, I believe, on PGCs, but it's 2 days and it's not mandatory. So
I genuinely think, because what people also need to understand is just how important it is, particularly for children in their formative years. We don't want to be teaching them, you know, whether indirectly or directly, that their conditions are something to be ashamed of. I mean, if teachers had this training, you know, a bit more training than, as you say, 2 days, I think there'd be there are a lot of quite traumatic events that I talk about in my comic, things which, unfortunately, years later I was told that I had PTSD, and I'm on anxiety medication, and all these things which were really spurred on by this attitude in schools, which is completely incongruous to any sense of understanding or sympathy to students who, you know, have these conditions. I mean, alternatively, my younger sister went to she has quite severe autism. She went to a specialist school where everyone there had obviously had much longer, much more, you know, prolonged training in looking after disabled children. And whenever I used to go there, it was fantastic just talking to them, because they just instinctively understood, you know, how these children were feeling. And then even me, I remember going there thinking, I want to go here, like, they're so wonderful. But you're absolutely right, Qona, and Simon, everybody, this is something that has to be rectified. There are quite a few really interesting questions that have come up in the chat.
Some links as well, actually, Ellen. Yeah.
Links, yeah.
Really good.
There's any comments about the use of text alongside graphic images? Is that in the sense of how it works from a communication perspective?
Yes, that was my question. Yeah.
I suppose I'm saying this not from a clinical or education perspective, but more from a personal thing. There is often what happens with children who have got, or just, you know, people in general who've got conditions like ADHD, dyspraxia, is that there's a fatigue that sets in when you're sitting down, you're reading great big blocks of text for, you know, long periods of time. You get very, very tired of it, and you often just forget things, or there is an issue with short-term memory as well. But with comics, it kind of helps to sort of balance that, because you're being facilitated with your brain, and your attention span is being facilitated by the images, but then you've also got the text to kind of accompany it. So it definitely speaks your language in a way. I would say it strikes that balance that we need to be able to comprehend these things.
Can you hear me? Also, the unflattering has no text. That, you know, that book that she mentioned that was a PhD.
Yeah.
has a very complex narrative about education and how education sort of forces children into sort of cookie cutter type shapes of thinking, is done with almost no text, as is Sean Tan's The Arrival, and all of his work has no text at all, which of course is good in that it opens the the reader's mind to the possibility of anything. But if you have an actual message, you have to make sure that the thinking isn't too lateral, so that people are kind of going way beyond going off into a different sort of world from your intended narrative. But I think you're right. Block of text is a block, a barrier.
Yeah.
Sorry to talk so much.
Oh no, that's fantastic points. It's interesting how you say it is like a barrier. That's definitely what it feels like. I mean, what I am going to be doing, later this year, I'm starting a PhD, and it's practice-based, and a lot of it I'm going to be doing through comics, because I seem to remember it's following on from my dissertation, but I remember when I was doing my dissertation, which was related to internet storytelling and images, that I felt as though I was wasting loads of time explaining what the images meant when the images could just do it themselves. And that's something that, again, I don't understand why people don't understand this, but images are so descriptive, and often more so than just using words.
Can I just ask, is anything on the English curriculum acknowledging that there's more than one, at least more than one literacy, that it's not all verbal literacy? We have to have visual literacy. I had only just recently at a conference learned more about document literacy, which is a whole other thing. And surely we need to, are we teaching our kids how to read images? And if we're not, that's absolutely absurd, isn't it? Because we're in such a visual world and engagement. There's some tremendous comments in here. Very interesting one just here from Peter Nencini about his son and how when he's been homeschooling, he's been making all sorts of exciting visual stuff, visual pieces of work as part of his coursework, but he doesn't submit it to school. So there's homeschooling that actually maybe that's a positive thing from the whole pandemic, is that maybe parents homeschooling are realizing maybe we can teach our kids better, and maybe our kids respond in ways that wouldn't fit into the normal curriculum of, sorry, you have to write an essay, it's got to be all, no pictures, maybe.
Oh, and there's a fantastic comment as well from Madeline, saying that she's also going to be doing a practice-led PhD specialising in graphic novels. MA work explore the, oh wow, that's fantastic. My work will explore the I hope I'm saying this right, the phenomenology of the creative act, how it feels when we are trying to create, what our thought processes look like. These pages in between the finished work show the slow forming of these ideas and the visual and textual motifs coming into her awareness. Yeah, and the power of mirroring as well, as you said, the idea of representing the way that someone is thinking is very important, because I think we often forget just how visual the human brain is as well. It's not as if when we go into our heads, it's just like a kind of matrix style series of numbers and text just like rolling down. We have a very visual brain. We don't dream in words, we dream in images. So and then I'm trying to get this. Yes, has anyone talked about this is from Patricia F. Anderson. Has anyone talked about the prevalence of neurodiversity among comics creators or the many works about autism, bipolar, and neurodiversity as a tangent through relaying their own personal experience with regard to other topics? I think Paul, you're well, I think encyclopedic knowledge. There's
yeah, but we all would know that some of the greatest creators of comics are special people. Basically, you could say they're often quite introverted at times. People like Robert Crumb or Chris Ware, for example, are find a way to be themselves on the page and certainly express themselves, perhaps more than they do in I mean, actually Ware and Qona are both well adjusted and et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is, yes, I would agree, there's a prevalence. And the medium, I think, the very fact that it's mixing and it's so fluid and flexible, mixing words and images, does attract a particular kind of person that isn't necessarily going to go, I'm going to be a painter or I'm going to be a novelist. Not to put either of those things down, but that's very much like I'm all about pictures or I'm all about words. Well, a lot of this about both. Just briefly, I'm currently finishing a book about Tove Jansson, who invented the Moomins, and I don't know if she was neurodiverse, but I know she had real problems in school. I mean, we know how brilliant she was. She was brilliant as the Moomin creator, but also as a painter, as a novelist. But she was allowed to leave school early, fortunately, go to art college and then develop her career. And one of the wonderful phrases I've just been reading in the Moomin books, which I think is worth repeating here, is Moomin Troll says at one point when he meets some of the diverse characters that are in the Moomins, like the Hemulans and the Hattifatnas and all those characters, he just says how very different people are. And it's said totally positively, not in any way critical, even though he's dealing with some very strange, sometimes quite awkward people. I mean, little Mai, we all know, is quite a, she's her own person, that's for sure. But this is the message of the Moomins, and I think it's there in her work quite clearly. So what we want is, in the Beano, please, we want a neurodiverse new character, or maybe there is already one there. But we've talked a bit about the Beano. We're about to have a massive exhibition at the Somerset House coming up in October with all sorts of artists interpreting the characters. It's going to be very exciting. Breaking the Rules, it's what it's called, I think. And maybe that's an idea for the Beano to introduce.
Yeah, certainly Desperate Dan. Certainly Desperate Dan's different.
He certainly is.
Yes. I do feel as though, reading Dennis the Menace, he's clearly a kid with undiagnosed ADHD who just needs a better outlet, but his parents just don't understand them at all. Basically.
And don't start it on Nasher, whatever you do.
There was a point I was going to make and I completely and utterly forgot it. Classic daft brain. But no, yes, you were talking about Tove Jansson and her time at school. It never occurred to me until just now, but because I love reading about the biographies of different comic artists, people like, my personal hero, my bespoke Jesus is Charles Schulz. I absolutely adore him. But with him and with many other comics creators, there is this thing of, you look at their childhoods and how they were in school, and that very, very often it's this, he struggled very much in school, or he felt very isolated, or even just that the character of Charlie Brown is very much, that's a kind of a representation. Schulz himself said that all the characters are representative of himself, but he very much, I think, when he was growing up, did feel like a bit of a Charlie Brown, in that he felt as though, and I really related to him when I was growing up as someone with undiagnosed dyspraxia, which is basically a condition which means that your motor skills are just absolutely terrible, and you're very clumsy and you're terrible at sports, and you can't understand why it is that you feel like you keep disappointing everybody. And for me, having a really bad game of rounders at school and being shouted at by the teacher because I wasn't able to catch a ball, and then coming back home and then reading about Charlie Brown being hit on the head with a high fly ball, and then staying there all night, wallowing in his own misery. It was so cathartic for me. I absolutely loved it. But there's, I think what needs to be acknowledged is that, people who, because what I don't want to do through this talk is to demonize, the more kind of left brain. I don't like the left brain, right brain way of thinking, but I don't like the left brain, right brain, description, because I think it's quite, it separates people a bit too much. But the more kind of, I'd say, logical or numerical way of thinking, I don't want to demonize that at all, because it's a wonderful way of thinking. And when I talk to people who do think like this, it often infers on my own work and what I'm doing. But what needs to happen is to just make things more welcoming and more collaborative, and to understand in these environments that this is this is what is needed, really. There's another question, Christopher Duffy. Are there any styles or approaches to comics that are more accessible to neurodiverse readers? Very broad question, I know. Yeah, I mean, because the other thing, because I think we haven't touched upon, is the various styles of comic. Because I'm sure that G.D. Soriano mentioned earlier about how the PhD comic has got no text in it whatsoever. But what also needs to be understood is the differing styles within comics. You know, comics are not just, you know, one set style of working. I've read books where, you know, there may be, you know, loads of text on one page. So, for example, with someone like Posey Simmons, who has loads of text and kind of intersperses, you know, letters and documents, and then you have very short form strips like with Charles Schulz and Jim Davis. That's interesting. I wonder if anyone has anything to say about the differences in, because Qona, I recall us having a conversation about the use of flashcards with autistic children, which I do remember us doing with my own sister, where you have just still images with the text underneath, and how important that is. Do you have anything to? I mean, that was really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to you about my eldest daughter, who works in a school for autistic children, and one of their ways of communicating is through these sort of flashcards, and there the drawings are very simple and very sort of standardized in a way. So, you know, a donut is very much almost a sort of simplified version of a donut, and the children learn to point to what they're trying to express. I think it's a really interesting question, you know, what style of comic, of what style of drawing would be the best way of expressing things to children on the spectrum, or children with dyslexia or dyspraxia. I don't know. I mean, I guess like all of us, people like have different styles that they prefer. I mean, when I showed the unhappy hippopotamus, you know, the thing I loved about those drawings was that they were so simple, and it's just black and white and pink the whole way through. And there was something about that when I was a child, and even this picture with Harriet reading lots of books, I thought, gosh, you know, she can sit there and read those books. Maybe I can too. And there was quite a lot of writing alongside it, but it was very, very poetic, and the lines were very short. I mean, surely there's a PhD there, isn't there, to investigate that further. Ellen, maybe your next one.
Yes. I was thinking just now, I've noticed in a lot of media, particularly in film and film, books, there is a common joke or a common trope where someone will say, you know, normally a character who is depicted as being unintelligent will say, you know, there's no pictures in this book, or and then someone will say, well, you know, you don't need pictures to be able to understand something. And it's this kind of, you know, this idea of reading with pictures is somehow, you know, it's automatically used to being a childish thing. I mean, I'm literally just remembering now in Beauty and the Beast where one of the characters said, oh, you can't read this, there's no pictures. And they said, well, you can just use your imagination, what are you talking about? Like, hang on a minute, I mean, what's wrong with pictures? Get out.
One thing that I always find quite intriguing is that a lot of students, the RCA students, when they come with their dissertations to sort of have a chat about them, very few of them use pictures, and you know, as part of the text. And I find it very hard to think about a subject I've not thought about before unless there's some kind of visual reference. So I'll always say, please, for my sake, please can you bring some pictures next time so I can actually see what you're talking about. But it's almost like they're indoctrinated at school. So, I'm doing an art and design MA, which is all about the sort of visual and spatial aspects. But this dissertation, that's writing. So we'll leave the pictures out of that bit because I've got to just use words. And so that's one of the things I do, is encourage them like mad to sort of add some kind of illustration or visual reference to their words.
Nick Sousanis is unflattening, clearly has a PhD, is entirely in comics form. So that kind of is an example. And there are others, I'm sure, and there are more probably to come. Also, actually, in many countries, certainly in Japan, we haven't mentioned manga, but there, comics are used for all kinds of things, including actually as textbooks. So there are course books entirely in, or certainly richly informed by comics, using the language of comics, which seems to be another obvious thing to think about in our own education system, to have comics used that way.
And Paul, can I ask in that?
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul. Can I ask in that aspect about Japan? Do you think that they accept it in their education system, or is it still something that's kind of like underground? Or
no, I think it's still probably still has some resistance. That said, I know that even in the early 60s, they introduced at least a module about the history of and roots of manga, and with its own agenda, because the Japanese Ministry of Education didn't want to particularly acknowledge the fact that, as we all really realize, that manga doesn't just come from Japanese tradition, it also comes from a lot of input from the West, whether it's British or American or international. But they did do this, and of course they connected it up to the Hokusai, and they made a great lineage of it. So there is more inclusion, and of course they also have whole courses devoted to comics. And there's at the university level now, we do have comics being taught around the world. There is a field of comic studies, which people may not know about. The first course in the UK began, this year, is it this? No, last year, at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And at the same time, the first one of its kind in France began in Bordeaux. And this is comic study. It's not making them, it's studying them. It's all of this academic, rich academic involvement and engagement with comics that is, again, hugely changed the landscape.
I'm very aware. This is a fantastic conversation we're having. I am aware of time a little bit, but this is brilliant. I could go on for bloody ages. But Peter Nencini sent a very, very interesting question. In terms of learning, are comics always to be seen, read, used, shared as a finished piece of content? Can real-time comic making in the company of others as a kind of dialogue be a tool? Yeah.
Well, I think when we were talking ages ago, Ellen, about possibility of you doing a workshop with neurodiverse children as a tool for externalizing what was going on in their heads and how they felt. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do remember looking, because I did my BA dissertation on, it was to do with comic. This was before I actually started, drawing and writing my own comics, but I was very interested in it as a kind of, from a philosophical perspective. But my dissertation was on the depiction of the Holocaust and Nazi Germany in comic books, because it turns out there are a lot more depictions of these events other than Maus by Ark Spiegelman, which is one of the most critically acclaimed graphic novels of all time. But I remember reading a very interesting piece where, because this is the other thing, I feel like the UK is very, very much behind in our attitude to comics as a learning tool, because in America they're actually introducing it into learning spaces. So there was I wish I could remember who these people are. I don't know, I'll put it online or something, but they did a thing where they were looking at how to educate children on traumatic world events, and situations, you know, happening in the news through the medium of comics, and how, you know, children sort of getting together and doing comic workshops where they draw their own images and they collaborate together with narratives is a very kind of healthy and sort of you know, cathartic way of reconciling traumatic events that have happened. So there were children doing comics, you know, in classrooms about the Holocaust and learning through that, and then not long after the September 11th attacks in 2001, there were also discussions about that. But I'd never thought of comics as being a way of, yeah, reconciling trauma and difficult subjects, because often it can be quite difficult for a child to be faced with these things, but to be given the medium of comics, which is something which children, you know, generally speaking, are you know, very much drawn to. It makes it more comfortable for them. It's a safe space for them. So maybe in the, you know, if I do end up doing these workshops, I think with probably disabled children, I think I would want to see, you know, obviously I'm still trying to work out how I would do this, but I would want to see if there is a way that they could express themselves. Because you know, I remember when I was younger and having these conditions and feeling as though I didn't have a voice and I wasn't able to express myself because the means of expressing myself within education were demonized. But giving that space for children to be able to be, you know, free to talk about their feelings. I know it sounds a bit, you know, get together and be happy, but genuinely, we need to value people's children's emotions and feelings very much, for them to grow up, you know, healthy and happy within themselves and who they are.
Patricia F. Anderson put something really interesting in the chat earlier, which was, I've been hearing from many neurodiverse artists who are creating comics about things like LGBTQ plus culture and asexuality or other aspects of life. And it's, I started thinking about that and how the parallels can be drawn between sort of having a disability and also being, you know, identifying as LGBTQ plus. And that I think maybe, as you were talking about trauma, like maybe like approaching, you know, I think that's an interesting tool potentially for people who consider themselves LGBTQ plus to use as a form of narrative to deal with certain traumas that they have been experiencing growing up in a predominantly heteronormative world. In the same way that people who consider themselves neurodiverse have grown up in a very, I don't want to say neurotypical because I hate that word, because it goes back to that.
Neuronormative, can we use that? Was that
neuronormative? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So yeah, I think that there's some interesting things going on there that I think, yeah, could be explored.
Definitely.
Definitely.
Yeah. Maybe I'm not sure about age group, but yeah. I'm
sure that I have seen some fairly recently. I have seen a lot of comics that kind of, there was one that I saw, again, I really should have written this down, but I didn't end up buying it because I'm broke at the moment, but there was a wonderful comic that was to do with the history of gay civil rights, and there was one to do with the history of, you know, the Stonewall riots back in '69, and it was written in a way that it was clearly for, you know, young children, but it was written in a way which was very, very approachable. And also, I mean, because in a way what I have found is that a lot of these comics, they kind of fill in the gaps of what is not being addressed in our education system. I mean, there's been a lot of talk recently, for example, about, you know, introducing a critical race theory into our schools. Because and thinking about it, I do remember when I was growing up, there wasn't really a lot of conversations about race and civil rights and things which really, really do need to be talked about in these environments. And the way that I actually learned about the civil rights movement in the 60s and Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, was actually through a comic. That was how I learned about this. It wasn't through school. And that really stuck with me, because I remember seeing the images and reading about all these, fantastic people from this age. And that's the thing. It's memorable. It sticks in your head. I could list so many things that, historical events and really important things that are just not talked about at all in our curriculum, that were introduced via comics.
I mean, just to answer the next question is, well, how do we make change? Because we're all kind of pretty much agreeing here. And apart from the diagnosis question, which is a major one, it seems to me, then there's just the fundamental one of who's going to listen and who's going to enable change to happen. I know that's enormously difficult to answer, but I just think this is a step, very important step. What the work you're doing yourself and the other participants here, but we need to find a way to get this message out, I think. And I would hope there might be models in other countries. I'm not aware of what's going on about these questions in the school systems elsewhere. We could at least look at that, I think, and find out what lessons can be learned, treat them literally as experiments that have worked. When they've worked, well, can we learn from this and can we apply that? Because a lot of the time people will listen if you show them that it's worked somewhere else, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think I know we've gone well over time here, but I think unless there are any pressing questions that anybody have,
we've got tons of stuff in the chat. God. They're off having fun. They're off doing their own thing over there.
No, I didn't expect them
to us at all.
It's such a brilliant response. This is amazing.
Wow. Yeah, it's tremendous.
I'm just reading them now. There's
a lot going on. There's a lot going on.
Yes. Yeah. But yes, there's a very, very good point that has been made by GD Soriano. It seems that messages and images speak a truth. Bad ideas and untruths can also be drawn in comics. They will be just as memorable as other truths. Well, the one thing that comes to mind when I think of that are the chick tracts in the United States. Yeah.
Which in the United States, my local area here down in Clapham was literally firebombed with chick tracts through everybody's doors. It was quite amazing. A lot of them were actually lodged still in the letterbox, and I went around. Perhaps I wasn't doing the right thing. I may go to hell, but I wanted to collect them. So I took them out the letterbox where they were stuck. But yes, that's a good example. And it's a very good point, isn't it? That, that we shouldn't pretend that, like everything, things can be used for good and for bad.
For those of you who don't know, chick tracts are essentially, it's a very, very extreme denomination of I think evangelical Christianity, which is not very pleasant. It's very, a lot of their work promotes things that are homophobic, sexist, racist, anti-Semitic, not pleasant at all. But luckily there is online, there's more people mocking them than there are people actually listening to them and reading them, I hope. But that's a very, very important point. Thank you for raising that.
Yeah, and I would perhaps add to that it's not just extremes, but actually some of the very popular comics, and one has to question sometimes what values. We know there are values in politics and attitudes conveyed in all media, and comics is no different. And some of them, fortunately, depending on your views about them, but I mean, Marvel and DC Comics have both at least tried to introduce more diversity up to a point, although it tends to be a little bit token, in my opinion, a little bit. But at least they've moved away from just, but there's still a lot of stereotyping, of course, of body types especially, which I think is also an issue. So yeah, it's not always going to be works of genius and works of sensibility. Yeah.
I think we should wrap this up. I hope that there's a way of saving the chat after this. I'm going to check if that's Debbie is just telling, my tutors are telling me that we have got the chat, so we'll be able to look at everyone's work and all the links that have been shared. So I will share that later. But it has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for coming, everyone who has come, and the guests for their wonderful perspectives. I really do appreciate you all coming, and then also the guests for contributing so many. You know, I think you guys kind of in a brilliant way hijacked the whole talk, and we were going down avenues that I didn't think we'd even talk about. This is wonderful. Thank you so much. So yeah, I don't know how to close it, but yeah, thank you everybody.
Best of luck with your
maybe we need to have a conference and a website to develop all of these connections and this community that's already building around what you're doing.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be too crawly, but but Ellen, what you're doing is a great book. I mean, I'm sure it's going to have a big impact when it gets out there, and so. I know you won't want to trumpet your work too much, but it is actually really worth reading. So do check Ellen Walker's website out. It's really worth reading what she's doing. Tremendous, yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, yeah. Goodbye, everybody. Do I end the meeting?
Ellen, do you want to put your email in? Do you want to stick your email in the chat so people?